It's one thing to listen to doom and gloom about food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation. It's quite another thing to hear practical, immediately actionable advice from experts who can help you reduce the fear, anxiety, and burden of these problems. Tune in now to the Surviving Hard Times podcast from the Finding Genius Foundation with Richard Jacobs. Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out, and I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide, that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on Current Initiatives. And now, to our guest. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Surviving Hard Times podcast, sponsored by the Finding Genius Foundation.
I have Kareen Erbe. She's the founder of Broken Ground Permaculture. If you go on YouTube, it's Broken Ground. And she also has a website, brokengroundpermaculture.com. She's a garden design consultant and an educator. And for over 10 years, she's helped people in cold climates grow their own food so they can eat healthier and live more sustainably and be more self-reliant. She's got a great YouTube channel with a lot of videos and thousands of people watching. So I wanted to talk to her. So, Kareen, thank you for coming.
Thanks so much for having me, Richard.
If you would tell me about your background, like how did you become a permaculturist and get into this area?
Yeah, so I studied environmental science at university, but then kind of took a bit of a turn and went into human rights and social justice work and spent a lot of time in Latin America. And became kind of an activist and worked for a non-profit organization doing activist work, social justice work in Latin America, but quickly became burned out and started looking for solutions. So I've always been someone who's been concerned about the environment, about ecological crises, about what we can do better. And I think I spent a lot of time as an activist being against someone or something and was looking for more positive solutions. And that's when I found permaculture and found that people who are involved in growing their own food are contributing to a positive ecological footprint, if we can put it that way. And just it's one of the most positive solutions to the current climate crisis. For example, one of the growing your own food is a reconnection to the natural world. And I just really found my people in that work.
So what does your work look like today? It sounds like you do some consulting and educating. What's a typical day or a month for you? What kind of activities?
Yeah, so it varies just based on the seasons, but a typical day. So I work with clients through education, consultation, and design. So I oftentimes do workshops where I'm educating people on gardening 101 or on permaculture. I also consult with clients one-on-one and go to their houses, their homes, troubleshoot with them in their gardens or tell them where to put what and why. And I also actually do edible garden designs for clients if they want the full on, service of a full scale homestead design of both fruit trees, maybe bare bushes, annual gardens. Maybe they want chickens, maybe they want rabbits, maybe they want goats, depending on what their goals and interests are. So I do all of those things while at the same time I run my own homestead. So I have large annual gardens. I have a food forest of fruit trees and berry bushes, and we have chickens and a pond and a greenhouse. So all of those things take a certain amount of time depending on the season. So in the early spring, I'm in my garden a lot. In the late fall for harvest time, I'm also doing a lot of preserving. But then in the winter, I get some time off from the garden and I'm able to work on my business in terms of what I need to do, what programs I'm going to offer the following year. So it's very dependent on the seasons. And I love that varied way of working as well.
So what are some of the common needs that people have with their, let's say, their property? They want to do some kind of a homesteading or growing. What are some of the, I don't know, major flavors of need that people have that you help them with?
Yeah. So one of the major things, obviously people come to me because they want to grow more of their own food, whether that's just a backyard garden that they can have their children involved in, or whether that's like full blown self-reliance. The other thing that people come to me for is that they want to get rid of their grass. And so, I'm based out of Montana, so we're in the West. And, we still have the suburbs where people want to have these green lawns, yet we don't have the rainfall for that. And so people don't want to waste their water just growing a lawn. They'd rather get something out of that. So whether that's food or whether that's a pollinator garden or that's some kind of beautiful landscape, those are some of the main reasons that people come to me. They either don't want to be watering a lawn and they want to turn that into food or habitat, wildlife habitat, or they're also really working towards some kind of level of self-reliance, or at least having some kind of garden so that they can grow some of their own food and have that on the dinner table, just doing that whole garden to table and have that as an experience.
Well, so if someone wants to dip their toe in, they've never gardened before, let's say they're concerned about upcoming food problems, what are like some basic things that they can do just to, again, dip their toe in without going crazy or, having a brown thumb and killing everything?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So one of the major things that I tell my clients is to start small. I think that we have become so disconnected from our food systems. Like, I don't know about you, Richard, but my grandmother was an avid gardener. My mom was as well, but that tradition of passing along that knowledge was interrupted, I think, by this large scale food system that we have now. And so for a lot of people, getting back to the basics of growing food seems like a fairly intimidating task. And not only that, but it does take a certain amount of your time. So what I usually recommend for people just starting out or dipping their toe in is to start with a very small garden plot. So usually like a 4x8 raised bed or something that's manageable so that they understand all of what is involved in terms of watering and maintenance and care. And then if they do want to go bigger than that, I always say you can grow into your garden, right? So the next year, maybe you have another raised bed, or the next year you put in some fruit trees or some berry bushes. So I definitely recommend you don't change your landscape all at once, just like natural systems, being patient with it and also doing it over 3 to 5 years in terms of what your capabilities are, the time that it takes. And as you grow into your garden and you gain more experience and you gain more skills in that arena. So starting small is my number one recommendation, and start with stuff that you want, that you eat on a daily basis. So you have a little more skin in the game. So if you really like green beans or you really like tomatoes or basil or lettuce, start with things that you not only like to eat, but that might be easier to grow.
So when people grow, do they do it outside? Do they do it in a greenhouse, hydroponically, inside their house? Like, what are some of the trade-offs you've seen and the actions people take?
Yeah. So I think it depends on your climate always, just in terms of what you want to do. Greenhouse growing is somewhat more challenging, but if you are in a cold climate, it's definitely going to gain you a season extension. In other words, you can put things in the ground a lot sooner than you can outside. Outdoor growing is more forgiving. Just in terms of you are dealing with the native soil on your site, you're probably, adding amendments and compost and all of that to make the soil better in terms of growing. But you have the whole kind of natural ecosystem of the outdoor garden to kind of help you along the way. So indoor growing is possible. Of course, it's more kind of energy intensive. So I always recommend to people you might as well, if you have the climate for it and the interest in it, you might as well start with growing outside because you have the natural sunlight helping you. It's not as energy intensive and you can grow a lot more and you have more space. But if you only have an indoor option, then there's certainly tons of things that you can grow indoors in pots to get started and to get familiar with the whole process of, taking a seed and putting it in the soil and seeing it become something that ends up on your plate.
Well, what are the additional inputs that you need for growing indoors versus out in the sun?
Yeah, so I think indoors you're looking at possibly getting grow lights. So special lights, oftentimes now they have LED ones, so they are less energy intensive. So that is certainly a possibility. So grow lights and then a potting soil mix that has a certain amount of nutrients in it. The difference that you have with growing in pots indoors versus outdoors is that every year you're going to have to add nutrients to that soil in the pot because there's only so much nutrient that plant can draw on because it's a limited amount of volume that you have. Whereas outdoors, you have a lot more volume that plant can draw on. So that's one of the things that in an indoor context, you'd probably likely be getting new potting soil or what are called amendments, fertilizers every year to help with the growing process. Whereas outside, you do have to add that fertility every year, but it's not as intensive a process.
Well, do you have to add it? I've heard of regenerative agriculture. How much can you reduce the inputs, let's say in an outdoor grow, and how would you do it?
Yeah, so you definitely, one of the main principles in permaculture is, basically creating as closed a loop system as possible. So in terms of fertility and inputs, a lot of that fertility might come from animals if you have them on site where you can use their manure, like chicken manure, or if you have rabbits, or if you have goats, any of that kind of stuff that can contribute to your fertility, and or growing plants that are nitrogen fixers. So those are things often that people hear, like clover is a nitrogen fixer, or beans or peas are nitrogen fixers. So they are drawing nitrogen out of the atmosphere and they're converting it into a readily available plant nutrient in the soil. So there are lots of different strategies that you can use on your site where you are year after year bringing in less and less inputs from outside of your space, for example. So that's definitely a possibility. Your listeners might be familiar with worm composting, for example. It's also known as vermiculture. So using red wiggler worms to break down your food waste, and then they in turn create these vermicastings, which are also another soil amendment. So definitely lots of different strategies in terms of soil building, in terms of soil regeneration. And in addition to that, things like compost teas, which basically introduce more soil microorganisms into your landscape. And those soil microorganisms are what make the nutrients available to the plants.
Well, if you make your own compost, is that enough for you to feed your own farm? Like what are some of the ballpark numbers on like how much compost you need for how many, let's say, square feet of growing space outside?
Yeah, that I don't have that number offhand. And like a lot of things in agriculture, it kind of depends on your site and what you're starting with. But typically, your typical home scale compost pile is not going to be adequate for a, say, 500 square foot garden, right? And that's where compost teas help extend the breadth of your compost. But you may also, have to bring in additional compost, and or if you do have animals in your system, then that's the way to bridge that gap. So it all depends on kind of the scale of your site. If you have a suburban site where you can have a lot of animals, then you might be looking at constantly bringing in inputs of compost. But if you have a large farm scale operation with animal systems on it, it's very likely that you'd be able to create and generate enough fertility on your site where you're not having to bring in additional inputs. I mean, one thing that people want to think about too is in a, say, urban or suburban context, you're maybe closing the loop on a community-wide level. You might not be able to do it on your site just because of the scale of your site, but looking at, there are all sorts of initiatives now in different cities around residential composting services, for example. So, companies that pick up compost from residents around the whole city, they take all of those kitchen scraps, convert it into, and they have like a large scale operation, and they convert that into compost that they either sell back to the residents and or give back to the residents. So in that sense, designing at a community scale in terms of producing no waste is also a way of thinking about how you're designing your site, especially if you're in an urban or suburban context.
What are some of the plants or vegetables that are easiest to grow for people outside for their first time?
Yeah, great question. So things like radishes, lettuce, peas, zucchini, beans, all of those, kale, Swiss chard, all of those are fairly easy plants to grow. When you get into more of your warm season crops like tomatoes and peppers and eggplant, some of those can be a little bit more finicky or need a little bit more of your attention. But those basics are, I'd say start with the basics. And then, you can move on the following few years as you gain more experience with some of the plants that take a little bit more of your care.
What about for indoor growing? What kind of hydroponic systems do you recommend?
Yeah, I'm less familiar with hydroponics. I mean, usually with a lot of hydroponic systems, you are still growing kind of leafy greens type stuff because it's less intensive. So I'd say I don't know as much about the hydroponics and what's easier or harder, but I would say that things that are leafy, one, take less nutrient and less input and less time. So usually people starting out probably in the hydroponics field would go with things like that.
Well, with the different hydroponic methods, I mean, do you recommend ever doing soil inside a greenhouse or hydroponics inside a greenhouse or inside the house, or what medium?
Yeah, I always recommend soil. I'm a big fan of soil. I know hydroponic systems, in a sense, in an urban environment, make a lot of sense in terms of resources, but there's nothing that beats hands in the soil. And I think that ultimately, that's how we started out as, agricultural, as humans in agriculture is with soil. And there's just, soil is incredibly forgiving on the one hand, and it's a natural system, whereas in a hydroponic system, you're always having to add inputs into that system. In a soil situation, you can over time set up a system where you need less and less inputs over time, and you have the natural system doing the work for you. So it's always about, what I love about the work that I do is it's an invitation for people to reconnect to the natural world and to natural systems. And, there's a saying that if you take one step towards nature, she takes 10 steps towards you. And it's really understanding those natural systems, ushering them along, and seeing the abundance that comes from that. And so when you work with existing natural systems, it's a lot easier than if you're looking at, say, a hydroponic system that takes a certain amount of tech and plastic and nutrient inputs, which don't get me wrong, I think there's a place for hydroponics, but it's a little bit more intensive in terms of inputs and in terms of the gardener themselves having to be a part of it.
So for indoors, you still recommend soil, and it's doable inside a house or inside a greenhouse? Soil will work just fine, or no?
Yeah, I mean, definitely in a greenhouse, that would be the way to go, like in my opinion. I'm sure a lot of other people might say otherwise. In terms of indoors, you do have a limited, I think it depends on your space. So a lot of things in gardening are always, it depends, it's kind of like, how much space do you have? How much time do you have? What's your setup in terms of, like, do you have a south facing window? Where is your location? What climate are you in? And so all of those kind of factor into the best design for you. And that's how I work with my clients, is just, what are your goals? How much do you want to grow? What is your circumstance in terms of your yard, your sun and shade? What's the climate? All of those things factor into the best kind of growing strategy for your site. But yes, I am still very partial to soil if you can do it and manage it.
Well, what are some crops that people want to grow, but you don't advise it, let's say, until they're way advanced, or maybe not at all?
Right. Yeah. Again, it can be climate dependent. If you have a greenhouse, you have a lot more that you can grow. But for example, trying to grow ginger or sweet potatoes in a cold climate is going to be a really challenging proposition, even if you have a greenhouse. There are certainly certain types of greenhouses that make that possible. I work with a guy, Jerome Ozentowski, with the Central Rocky Mountain Permaculture Institute, who has a tropical greenhouse at 7,200 feet in Basalt, Colorado, right? Using a greenhouse design called a climate battery. So things like that are possible. It gets back to, people's budget and abilities. Things like melons in a cold climate, those are harder because you don't have as long a growing season. Melons and sometimes winter squash can be challenging. But it's all dependent on how much time and energy people want to dedicate to growing and how much they want that. If they really want that melon, then they might spend a little bit more time. But some things, in the subtropics, sweet potatoes grow like weeds, right? So, but things, people in cold climates, how can I grow a lime or a lemon tree? Well, that's going to be harder to do, and you will definitely need a greenhouse. It's possible. But I think constantly there is a saying in permaculture, forcing function, where the input in, is that worth the yield that you get out? And that's constantly something that you want to weigh as a gardener is the input of time, energy, or money that I put into this system worth the yield that I get out? And what I mean by that too is is building a massive climate battery greenhouse that might cost, tens of thousands of dollars worth the lime or the lemon tree that I get out? It could be depending on what the goals are for your site and for yourself. And you always have to weigh that. It's also one of those things where in a cold climate, if we're at fairly high latitude during the winter months from December through February, we get very little light. So is it worth trying to run a greenhouse during that time? Because the vegetables, right, or the greens, the spinach, the lettuce, whatever you have growing, needs extra heat and it needs extra light. And so is that input of energy worth the yield that you get out? Or is that head of lettuce costing you 10 to 15 bucks for that head of lettuce? Is that really worth it? So you're constantly making those types of decisions based on where you're at.
Do you or anyone cultivate mycorrhizae, the fungal hyphae that, will augment a plant's ability to grow in soil? Do you add it? Do you cultivate it? Do you know anyone that does?
Yeah, so that's definitely, by virtue of, I add a lot of additional wood chip to my property. So in my food forest, which is mostly fruit trees and berry bushes and perennial flowers and herbs, I will add wood chip from a local arborist who, prunes a bunch of trees in town and dumps a bunch of wood chip on my site. I will add that to the food forest. And there is naturally mycorrhizal fungi in that wood chip. So that just kind of comes in regardless of what I do. I don't need to necessarily inoculate that wood chip because it's just kind of a natural part of the system. So if you are building a perennial system, in other words, plants that come back year after year, you are naturally marching that ecosystem towards a fungally dominated soil, as opposed to an annual system where that's more of a bacterially dominated soil. So mycorrhizal fungi are inherently in soil. And the more you feed that soil, grow that soil, add organic matter to that soil, the more you will be growing that network. And it's not to say that you can't also inoculate that soil with beneficial fungi as well. And so you're, again, understanding that natural system. You may want to go to like a forest nearby in your ecosystem, get like a couple tablespoons of that soil, be very respectful, not to take too much and not to impact that natural ecosystem as much, but get, a few tablespoonfuls of that soil and bring it into and inoculate your soil with those organisms. So that
how much does inoculating help? Is it easy to do? And, does it make a big difference that you observe?
Yeah, it's hard to know everything that's going on, right? There's still so much mystery to the soil food web. There's definitely a lot of studies that have gone on. I know your podcast also focuses on gut microbiome. And so there's a lot of the soil food web. There are a lot of unknowns still. And so how beneficial is it? We know that it's beneficial to inoculate soil, especially if you're trying to grow any kind of food, to inoculate it with fungi. What we don't, some of the stuff we just don't know, right? In terms of, how quickly it grows, and to what extent. But it's not going to hurt, especially if you're taking the native soil from your area. I think there are questions as to whether or not you want to use mycorrhizal fungi that's from, say, some commercial product, and whether you want to introduce that into your soil. There are definitely questions around that. But I would recommend that if people want to do that, some of that's just going to naturally come in. I've also, in my food forest, inoculated with King Stropharia mushrooms that are edible. So that's also an option for people too.
Okay. In terms of, have you explored like aquaculture? Does anyone that you work with do that? Have you tried any other alternative methods, like helping people grow mushrooms themselves, or do you stick to, mostly outdoor stuff and a little bit of indoor?
Yeah, so there is a local company in town called Montana Roots that does a lot with aquaponics. So again, using fish as that's a way to close the loop in a hydroponic system, is to bring it to aquaponics, where you have that extra yield of fish, and the fish are doing the fertility or creating the fertility for you. So that's definitely a way to go. So they seem to be fairly successful at doing that. That's not my area of expertise or wheelhouse. I do focus more on greenhouse growing with soil and outdoor growing more than anything. But I do think that that's actually, more than hydroponics, aquaponics might be better way to go because of the decreased inputs that you need. Yes, there's the fish food, but it seems like a better system than just straight hydroponics.
Have you eaten crops in an aquaponic system?
I have. Yeah. And, one of the things with aquaponics or hydroponic systems is the crops have more water in them. So I do think that you lose some of the nutrient density and the taste from hydroponics and aquaponics, but it's also, it's better than nothing. It's better than, going, having your lettuce travel 1,500 miles to get to your plate. And so I think that's also a consideration, right? Just in terms of, you have different levels of what we can do to strengthen our local food systems. And I'd much rather choose a hydroponically grown lettuce that's down the road from me than something that's traveled from California, for example.
So hydroponically grown stuff will probably look bigger and juicier but it tends to have less taste in your experience and may not have the same level of nutrition.
Yes. Yeah. Because nothing beats the soil, and all of the complexity of soil microorganisms that we can't see, but that are doing their work.
Can anyone, create, or is there a microbiome, even a hydroponic system? Has anyone studied that?
Good question. I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know enough about it. I'd imagine that, people, when they're brewing compost teas, that's in water environment. So I don't know how people have been using, and if they've been using compost teas in the context of hydroponic systems. That's a great question.
What about a side-by-side comparison of, let's say, tomatoes grown hydroponically versus in soil, not just for taste, but for nutritional content? Has anyone embarked on that?
I bet they have, but I don't know. I don't know that study, but I'm sure they have. I think
it's okay. I've asked a lot of people, by the way, that everyone's like, oh, well, it's complicated. Every soil is different. But you can at least get like some order of magnitude. If you see that the nutritional profile is similar, okay. If you see it's radically different, that tells you something else, but at least you can see directionally something. Yeah?
For sure. Yeah. I'm sure if somebody hasn't studied that, somebody should. Definitely. But yeah, I don't know of any research offhand around that, but I do think that, again, it's like we have all sorts of strategies at our disposal around what works in what contexts and what makes sense for each context. And so I think, one of the things that I teach in my classes, there's all this concern as, with the climate crisis and with the ecological crises that we're up against is, how are we going to feed 9 billion people? And I always argue that we're going to feed 9 billion people by every community figuring out how they're going to feed themselves, that local food systems we need to figure out place-based local systems where we make decisions based on the climate, the culture, the resources that are available locally and regionally to that area. That's how it was done in the past, and that's how we should move forward. There is not going to be, in my opinion, a silver bullet solution to feeding the world. It is going to be going back to the basics of what is every, climate, what works well in those climates, how much water do you get, what the soil is like, and what the culture is like, and what plants do well. And it's kind of going and extending from there. But definitely in urban environments, that's why, where soil is limited and land is limited, some of these hydroponic and aquaponic systems make sense.
What about water retention? Do you advise on that? And how important or critical is it for people?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think water is life. No blue, no green is what they say, right? That we need water to grow food. And so any kind of, again, depends on your climate, right? You might get an overwhelming amount of water, so you might not need it as much. But especially in the West, we're always looking at water capture strategies. So whether that's conserving water by mulching our gardens, keeping them covered, or using drip systems, for example, or whether that's rainwater capture strategies around rainwater barrels, cisterns, infiltration basins, rain gardens, ponds, all of those swales, which are ditches on contour, all of those different strategies, depending on your site, depending on your slope, depending on your rainfall, are things that you want to consider. Water and soil are interconnected, and so we need both in order to grow food, to grow plants, to grow habitat. So it's really important to pay attention to it.
Well, very good. Kareen, where can people find out more info about you? I mentioned it in the beginning, but if you wouldn't mind restating it.
Yeah, so I have a website that's brokengroundpermaculture.com. I'm also on Instagram at brokengroundmt, and I have a YouTube channel as well, which is Broken Ground. So yeah, people can check me out in all of those places. I run a Resilient Homestead program, which is an online program that's starting here actually in November, where I take people through, all they need to know around permaculture and permaculture principles, and also kind of planning their sites. So yeah, just check me out, visit me, contact me if you have any questions.
Very good. Kareen, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before you stop listening, ask yourself, what are 1 or 2 useful things you heard on this podcast that can help you overcome food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation? Please like and subscribe and tell your friends and family about their Surviving Hard Times podcast. We're all going to need help now and in the near future.